Montana Territory. October 1886. The first snow of the season had not yet fallen on the Judith Basin, but everyone who had lived through the winters there knew what was coming. They had seen it before, the kind of cold that arrives without apology, that drops temperatures to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius before Christmas and stays there for weeks. The kind of cold that kills livestock in their barns, freezes well solid, and turns a poorly built cabin into a slow coffin. That autumn, the small farming community near Lewistown had one main topic of conversation. It wasn't the cattle prices or the approaching harvest. It was her, Margaret Sorrell, a 34-year-old widowed homesteader, had spent the better part of the summer doing something that made every man in a 20-mile radius certain she had lost her mind. She wasn't building a cabin. She wasn't framing walls or raising a roof. She was digging, carving a home directly into the south-facing limestone ridge at the edge of her claim, like an animal preparing a den. The most experienced builder in Lewistown, a man named Douglas Het, who had framed over 40 structures across central Montana, saw the excavation one afternoon in August and reportedly said just 4 words: "She'll freeze in there." He was wrong, but he wouldn't know that for another 4 months. Today, you're going to find out what Margaret Sorrell understood about heat, stone, and survival that the most experienced builders in her region had completely missed. And it starts with a principle so simple, so old, and so devastatingly effective that it's almost embarrassing it was ever forgotten. If you want a new piece of forgotten survival knowledge every single week, techniques that were tested not in laboratories but in real winters, by real people whose lives depended on getting it right, subscribe now. Every video on this channel is built on that same standard. No theories, only what actually worked. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know what kind of winters you face, because that context matters for everything that follows. Margaret Sorrell had come to Montana Territory 3 years earlier with her husband Jonas, 2 mules, a wagon loaded with tools, and enough lumber to frame a modest single-room homestead cabin. Jonas had died of fever in the summer of 1884, 14 months after they filed their claim, before the cabin was ever finished properly. She had survived 2 winters in that unfinished structure, and she had learned, firsthand, exactly what was wrong with it. The cabin sat above the ground on a stone foundation, exposed on all 4 sides of the wind that swept off the snowy mountains without interruption. The floor, built from rough-hewn pine planks laid over a crawl space, radiated cold upward through the boards like a slab of ice. Margaret had documented in her personal journal, portions of which were preserved by her granddaughter and referenced in a county historical record compiled in 1941, that during the January of 1885, the temperature inside the cabin at floor level had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 8 degrees Celsius, even with the stove burning continuously. The stove sat in the corner. The far walls stayed cold. The heat rose straight to the ceiling and vanished. She had burned through 11 cords of wood that winter, a staggering amount for one person. She had hauled, split, and stacked every piece of it herself. And by February, she was rationing. When the second winter came and went the same way, Margaret began asking a different question. Not, how do I heat this cabin better? But why does this cabin refuse to hold heat at all? The answer, she concluded, was exposure. Every wall she had was a surrender point. 4 flat planes of thin wood, each one in direct contact with air that could drop to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 34 degrees Celsius, or lower. The ground, on the other hand, just 18 inches below the surface, maintained a temperature of approximately 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 to 7 degrees Celsius, even in the depths of a Montana winter. The earth itself was an insulator, a massive, omnipresent, entirely free insulator. She spent that spring thinking. By June of 1886, she had made her decision. She filed no paperwork, asked no one's permission, and sought no contractor's opinion. She picked up a pickaxe and walked to the limestone ridge. What she was attempting had roots older than any European settlement in North America. The Mandan people of the upper Missouri had built earth lodges with thick sod roofs and semi-subterranean floors for centuries, maintaining interior temperatures that stunned early explorers. Celtic peoples across the British Isles had constructed similar earth-integrated shelters. Even the Norse settlers in Greenland had survived in structures built half into hillsides, using the thermal stability of the ground as their primary defense against the cold. Margaret Sorrell likely had no direct knowledge of these traditions, but she arrived at the same answer through sheer, practical reasoning. The earth held warmth. She would live inside it. The excavation took most of June and all of July. Margaret dug into the south-facing slope of the limestone ridge at an angle, carving out a space roughly 18 feet wide by 22 feet deep, about 5.5 by 6.7 meters. The ceiling height at the center reached 7 feet, 2.1 meters. She removed the loose material by hand and by mule-drawn drag, piling the excavated soil and rock to the sides, and eventually using it to build up additional berm, a thick earthen wall, on the north and east-facing sides of the structure. The floor was compacted earth, not wood, bare stone and packed clay. Cold to bare feet, yes, but critically stable. No crawl space, no exposed underside, no gap for wind to rush through. The ground itself formed the thermal foundation. The walls were the key. Margaret lined the interior faces with limestone blocks salvaged from the ridge and from a collapsed settler's chimney 2 miles east. These blocks, each weighing between 80 and 200 pounds, 36 to 90 kilograms, were stacked dry without mortar and fitted tightly to the earthen walls behind them. The stone did not provide insulation in the traditional sense. It did something more important. It stored heat. This is thermal mass at work. Stone and dense earth absorb heat slowly and release it even more slowly. A limestone wall 14 inches thick, 35 centimeters, can absorb heat from a fire lit in morning, store it through the afternoon, and radiate it back into the room through the night, long after the fire has burned to ash. Wood-frame walls, by contrast, absorb almost nothing. Heat a wood cabin. The moment the fire goes out, the heat goes with it. Margaret positioned her single stove, a small cast iron box stove she had salvaged from the remains of Jonas's unfinished cabin, in the center of the back wall, surrounded on 3 sides by the densest concentration of limestone she could arrange. The stones around and behind the stove would reach temperatures of 200 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 93 to 121 degrees Celsius, during a good burn, and would radiate warmth for 6 to 8 hours afterward. The entrance was intentional as well. Rather than a door cut directly into the hillside face, Margaret built a short tunnel vestibule, approximately 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, 1.8 by 1.2 meters, that served as an airlock between the outside cold and the interior living space. When the outer door opened, it did not expose the main room to outside air. The vestibule trapped a cushion of air that buffered the thermal exchange. Cold in buffer zone, warmth maintained. The roof was the boldest part of the design. She did not build a peakwood roof. She layered the top of the excavation with a low frame of cottonwood poles, packed it with 18 inches, 45 centimeters, of compacted earth, and topped it with sod. The entire roof was a living thermal blanket. 18 inches of soil provides an insulation value that no standard wood roof of the era could match, and it accumulated snow in winter, adding yet another insulating layer. The more brutal the storm, the better the roof worked. The result, from the outside, looked like a barely visible mound with a rough timber door set into the hillside. From inside, it was a dry, dark, entirely sheltered room, cool in summer and about to prove something extraordinary in winter. Lewistown in the autumn of 1886 was not a large community, perhaps 300 people, scattered between the town proper and the surrounding homestead claims. But it was a community with habits, with hierarchies, and with strong opinions about how things should be done. News of what Margaret was building spread the way news always did in frontier towns. Through the general store, through the post office, to the quiet conversations held over fence lines between neighbors. Most people had not seen the structure themselves. They had heard about it secondhand. But that was more than enough to form a verdict. The reaction divided itself into two categories, amusement and concern, though often it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. At the lighter end, the commentary was wry. A local account preserved in Fergus County records from that period notes that the dwelling was referred to more than once as the Badger Hole. Children reportedly dared each other to walk past on the road. One merchant in town, a man with a reputation for dry humor, told customers that Margaret had solved the problem of a coal cabin by simply removing the cabin. The joke made the rounds. But Douglas had, the experienced builder who had seen the excavation in August, was not joking. He had built structures across 4 territories. He understood timber, foundation work, and roofing, and he was certain that what Margaret had done violated every sensible principle of frontier construction. His objections were specific. First, moisture. Earth-sheltered structures, in his experience, wept condensation and trapped water against a framing, rotting it within 2 or 3 seasons. He had seen dugout cellars turn to mud from the inside. Second, ventilation. A room carved into a hillside with a sod roof, and a single door would accumulate smoke and stale air faster than any frame cabin. The stove would either choke itself out or choke her. Third, the psychological toll. He had seen what dark, confined quarters did to people through a long Montana winter. It wasn't a home, he said. It was a hole. At a gathering at the Methodist Church in early October, Het reportedly stated his conclusion plainly, loud enough for several witnesses to remember it clearly. A structure that the ground itself has to hold up is not a structure. It's a gamble against a spring thaw. Margaret Sorrell was not present at the church that evening. She was at home, splitting the small amount of firewood she intended to use that winter, less than half the amount she had burned the year before. She was not gambling. She was calculating. The winter would settle the argument, and it arrived early. The cold snap came in the 3rd week of November, 1886, weeks earlier than usual, and with ferocity that caught the region unprepared. The winter of 1886 to 1887 would go on to be recorded as one of the most catastrophic in the history of the northern Great Plains. Oral accounts collected by Montana historical researchers in the early 20th century described temperatures plunging to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius, and remaining there for days at a time. Wind chased the cold across the open basin, with nothing to stop it. Cattle died in the thousands across the territory. Homesteaders who had not stacked enough before October found themselves burning furniture, fence rails, and, in the most desperate cases, the structural timbers of their own buildings. In Lewistown and the surrounding claims, the pattern was familiar and grim. Frame cabins that had seemed adequate in November became ice boxes by December. The problem was not always the stove. It was the walls. Standard frontier cabin construction used roughly 6 to 8 inches, 15 to 20 centimeters, of hewn log or rough-sawn timber. In ordinary winter conditions, that was barely sufficient. In a sustained blast of minus 35 to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 37 to minus 40 degrees Celsius, wind, it was nothing. Heat poured out through the walls as fast as it was generated. Families burned around the clock and still woke up with frost on their blankets. Douglas had his own cabin, a well-built, double-walled log structure by the standard of the time, consumed nearly a quart and a half of it per week during the worst of December. His family kept the stove running at all hours in shifts just to keep the temperature above freezing in the main room. Margaret Sorrell fired her stove twice a day. Morning and evening, she fed the cast iron box stove a measured load of dry cottonwood, between 12 and 15 pounds, 5 to 7 kilograms per burn. The fire ran hot for 2 to 3 hours, driving the surrounding limestone to its full thermal absorption. Then she let it die. The stone held the heat. The earth held the room. The sod roof held the warmth inside, while the snow piling on top of it added another 8 to 12 inches, 20 to 30 centimeters, of natural insulation above the structure. The vestibule entrance stopped the cold air from rushing in each time she opened the door. Every element worked together, not by accident, but because each one addressed a specific heat loss pathway that her old cabin had left wide open. She did not feel heroic about it. She felt warm, and she noticed with a quiet clarity that she was not exhausted. Stay with us, because in the next chapter, we're going to put exact numbers to what happened inside that hillside room. And one of those numbers is going to rewrite everything Douglas had thought he understood about heat and shelter. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This is a kind of knowledge that was nearly lost, and we are not going to let it disappear. The comparison between Margaret Sorrell's earth-sheltered dwelling and the standard frame cabins of the Lewistown area during the winter of 1886 to 1887 was not conducted with scientific instruments or formal methodology. What we have are first-hand accounts, journal entries, and a detailed observation recorded by a traveling Methodist circuit minister named Reverend Aldous Price, who visited the region in January of 1887 and made notes about living conditions across 12 homesteads, including Margaret's, as part of a report submitted to a regional mission board. That report, referenced in a Fergus County historical survey from 1938, provides the most reliable comparative data available. Reverend Price recorded interior temperatures using a small household thermometer he carried with him. On the morning of January 14th, 1887, following a night when the outdoor temperature had dropped to an estimated minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 39 degrees Celsius, he made his rounds. In the frame cabins he visited, interior morning temperatures after an overnight fire, meaning a fire that had been kept going at reduced intensity through the night, ranged between 32 and 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 to 7 degrees Celsius. One household reported burning continuously for 18 hours straight and waking to find ice formed on the inside of the window frame. He visited Margaret Sorrell's dwelling on the same morning. The stove had not been fired since the previous evening. She had slept through the night without tending the fire. When Reverend Price arrived, he recorded the interior temperature at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, more than 10 to 20 degrees warmer than the frame cabins that had run their stoves all night. The limestone walls had stored the evening's heat and been releasing it slowly through the darkness. No one consumed. No one woke up to tend the stove. The thermal mass did the work while she slept. The firewood comparison was equally stark. Oral accounts from Margaret's own records, referenced in the 1941 county history, indicate she used approximately 3 to 4 cords of wood for the entire winter of 1886 to 1887. Her neighbors in comparable-sized frame structures reported burning between 9 and 14 cords. The difference, roughly 60 to 70% less was consumed, was not a matter of comfort tolerance or thrift. It was a matter of physics. She was not heating the outdoors through thin walls. She was heating a room the ground itself was helping to hold. There was one more number that Reverend Price noted, almost as an aside. He wrote that the interior of the dwelling maintained an even, dry warmth, free of the damp chill one finds pressed against the exterior walls of timber frame structures. Moisture, Douglas's primary objection, had not been the problem he predicted. The limestone walls, backed by dense earth, were dry. The vestibule entrance limited the humid air exchange, and the sod roof, rather than trapping moisture, distributed any condensation gradually through the soil away from the living space. Het had been wrong on every count, but to his credit, he was about to admit it. Spring came late to the Judith Basin in 1887, which meant the comparisons between Margaret Sorrell's winter and her neighbors had weeks more time to settle into the community's collective memory before the ground thawed and attention turned to planting. The shift was not dramatic. There was no public meeting, no formal reversal judgment, no newspaper headline declaring that the woman with the badger hole had been right all along. It happened the way most genuine changes happen in small, close communities, quietly, with a lot of questions dressed up as casual conversation. The first person to approach Margaret directly was a Finnish homesteader named Arvid Mäkinen, who had settled 6 miles north of her claim 2 years earlier. Arvid had burned through 12 cords of wood that winter and had come within 2 weeks of running out entirely. He showed up in March, hat in hand, and asked, with the careful indirectness of a man who had spent the winter calling her dwelling a folly, whether she might show him how she had arranged the stones around the stove. She showed him. She explained the vestibule. She walked him around the outside and described how the berm on the north face cut the wind before it reached the wall. She talked about the sod roof and the logic of letting the snow accumulate instead of clearing it. Arvid listened without interrupting, asked a handful of precise questions, and went home. By May, he was excavating his own south-facing slope. Douglas Heck came in April, not to Margaret's door, but to Reverend Price, who had shared his January observations with several community members. According to a letter Het wrote to a brother in Ohio, preserved in family records and quoted in a regional history published in 1952, he acknowledged that the ventilation and moisture problems he had anticipated had not materialized as expected, and that the thermal performance of the stone-lined walls exceeded what any timber framing could achieve under equivalent conditions. He did not use the word wrong, but the meaning was clear. What followed was not a revolution, it was an adaptation. Frontier people were practical above all else. They did not need to be told that an idea was now officially acceptable. They needed to see that it worked and understand why. By the winter of 1888 to 1889, local oral accounts suggest that at least 7 homesteads within a 30-mile radius of Margaret's claim had incorporated some version of her principles. If not a full earth-sheltered structure, then at minimum a stone thermal wall behind the stove, a vestibule entrance to break the wind, or a sod addition banked against the north wall of an existing cabin. None of them called it Margaret's method. They called it sensible, which, in the parlance of the Montana frontier, was about as high a compliment as a building technique could receive. Margaret Sorrell herself added a small root cellar to the north end of her structure in the summer of 1888, using the same limestone and earth construction. It maintained a steady 38 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, year-round, keeping her preserved food stable without ice. The same principle, thermal mass and earth insulation, that had kept her warm in winter kept her food cool in summer. The physics did not care about the season. It only followed the laws of heat exchange, which had not changed since the first human being pressed a hand against a sun-warmed stone. Margaret Sorrell did not invent earth-sheltered living. She rediscovered it. The principle she applied in the Judith Basin in 1886 is as old as human settlement in cold climates. It appears in the semi-subterranean Mandan earth lodges of the upper Missouri River, where interior temperatures stayed livable through winters that killed European visitors who slept in canvas. It appears in the Norse longhouses of Iceland, banked with turf on 3 sides to resist the Atlantic wind. It appears in the Irish souterrain, underground stone-lined passages attached to ancient dwellings, and in the Barabara, the unending people of the Aleutian Islands, structures built almost entirely below grade that could maintain temperatures above freezing with minimal fire. Every cold culture in human history, given enough time and enough winters, arrived at the same conclusion. The earth is not the enemy of warmth. It is its most reliable ally. What made Margaret's story remarkable was not the technique. It was a context in which she used it. A context of relentless skepticism, of expert dismissal, of social pressure conformed to the standard method, even when the standard method was demonstrably inadequate. She built her home with her own hands, in the face of laughter and condescension, and then she survived one of the worst winters in recorded Montana history, on less wood than her neighbors burned in a single month. She was not lucky. She was precise. Every element of her design, the thermal mass of the limestone walls, the earth-insulated roof, the vestibule airlock, the south-facing orientation to capture winter sun, the absence of a raised floor that would bleed heat downward, addressed a specific, real mechanism of heat loss. She hadn't rejected modern knowledge. She had applied physical law more accurately than anyone else in her community. The lesson is not that old is always better. The lesson is that heat does not care about convention. It flows where the path is easiest. And if you build a structure that leaves every path open, for thin walls, a wood floor over crawl space, a roof that can't hold snow, the heat will leave as fast as you can generate it. Close the paths. Use what the ground offers. Work with the physics instead of pretending it doesn't apply to you. That is what Margaret Sorrell understood. It is what the Mandan builders understood. It is what the Norse settlers understood in Greenland. And it is what every cold climate culture relearns, sooner or later, whenever the winter gets serious enough to make the stakes real. The knowledge was never primitive. It was just waiting to be needed badly enough. If this story made you think differently about heat, walls, and the materials around you, hit like, share it with someone who builds, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We cover a new technique every week. Real methods, real history, real winters. No theories. Only what was tested when lives depended on the answer. And now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through? Tell us in the comments. The stories people share down there are some of the most remarkable ones we've ever read.